The year was 1881, and Dodge City stood as a monument to the unchecked expansion of American ambition across the plains of Kansas. A place where cattle drives concluded, where railroad tracks gleamed like silver promises in the harsh sunlight, and where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card. But beneath the veneer of progress and opportunity, darker currents moved through the dusty streets of this frontier outpost. Sheriff Clayton Blackwood arrived in Dodge City in the spring of 1878, a figure of immediate authority with his broad shoulders, immaculate mustache, and eyes the color of gunmetal. He had come from Tennessee with glowing recommendations and stories of heroism that preceded him like a herald. The town council had hired him without reservation, desperate for someone who could impose order on the chaotic streets where cowboys, gamblers, and desperate men collided in an endless dance of violence. "I'll bring civilization to this town," Blackwood had promised during his swearing-in ceremony, standing on the steps of the newly built courthouse, his badge catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Every man, woman, and child will sleep soundly, knowing justice walks these streets." For the first year, the citizens of Dodge believed they had found their savior. Crime rates fell. The nightly gunshots that had once been as common as coyote calls grew infrequent. The sheriff's jail cells were constantly occupied, but the trials were swift, the sentences harsh but seemingly fair. Blackwood was everywhere at once, breaking up fights at the Long Branch Saloon, patrolling the railroad station as new arrivals stepped onto Kansas soil, and riding the outskirts of town where homesteaders tried to carve out a living from the unforgiving prairie. Few questioned where the prisoners went after their sentences were pronounced. Some were sent to state facilities, others to work camps along the expanding railroad. But an unusual number seemed to simply disappear from the court records altogether, their names becoming whispers rather than documented facts. These inconsistencies might have raised concerns in a more established community, but Dodge City was still being born, its institutions young and flexible, its record-keeping subject to the chaos of frontier life. What the townspeople didn't know was that Sheriff Blackwood had purchased land 10 miles outside of town, a remote stretch of scrubland bordered by a sluggish creek and scattered cottonwood trees. The property had once belonged to a failed cattle operation, its abandoned buildings slowly surrendering to the elements. On paper, the land was registered to a company called Western Territory Investments, a name that appeared legitimate but led nowhere when traced through official channels. It was to this hidden property that Blackwood began transporting certain prisoners under cover of darkness. Not the common drunks or typical brawlers who filled his jail on Saturday nights, but specific individuals whose disappearance would raise few questions. A Lakota man found wandering too close to town, allegedly stealing horses. A pair of formerly enslaved brothers traveling north, their papers of freedom questioned by the sheriff despite their authenticity. A Mexican cattle driver abandoned by his companions after a dispute. These were the first unwilling residents of what Blackwood, in his private journal, referred to as his collection of human curiosities. By the winter of 1880, the abandoned ranch buildings had been transformed. The main barn was subdivided into cells with iron bars salvaged from a defunct mining operation. The farmhouse became Blackwood's occasional residence and office, its walls lined with books on phrenology, racial classification, and the new scientific theories of human hierarchy that were gaining popularity in academic circles. An old chicken coop was expanded into a long, low building where the growing number of captives could be displayed and observed through narrow viewing windows. The sheriff maintained his official duties in town with unwavering diligence, never giving anyone reason to question his methods or motives. When he required assistance at his secret establishment, he employed 2 men whose loyalty had been secured through a combination of payment and blackmail, former soldiers who had committed atrocities during the Indian Wars that even the military would not tolerate. These men, James Fowler and Marcus Reed, lived in a small cabin on the property, serving as guards, handlers, and witnesses to the growing horror. For the captives, life became an endless nightmare of degradation. They were fed enough to survive but not to thrive, kept in conditions that Blackwood meticulously documented as part of his scientific observations. They were forced to wear identifying placards with crude racial classifications and fictional tribal affiliations that served Blackwood's narrative rather than reality. Most devastating of all was the knowledge that they had become invisible, removed from the world as effectively as if they had been buried beneath the Kansas soil. By the beginning of 1881, Blackwood had 13 people imprisoned in his private exhibition. Each new edition required more elaborate justifications in the official record, more creative methods of abduction, and an expanding network of lies. Yet the sheriff's confidence only grew. He began to invite select guests to view his collection, traveling doctors with questionable credentials, wealthy cattle barons with a taste for the exotic, and even a professor from an Eastern university whose theories on racial development had caught Blackwood's attention. These private viewings typically occurred at night, with visitors arriving in closed carriages, their identities hidden from anyone who might be watching from the distant road. Inside the exhibition building, Blackwood would walk his guests past the cells, pointing out what he called specimens of racial degradation and primitive development, using the scientific language of the day to cloak his cruelty in a veneer of academic pursuit. What no one in Dodge City suspected was that behind Sheriff Blackwood's imposing badge and promises of civilization lurked a man consumed by twisted ambitions and the darkest expressions of power. As spring approached in 1881, his collection would continue to grow, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually force the town to confront the monster they had invited into their midst. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The stories here expose the dark truths of American history that mainstream education tries to hide. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss these crucial revelations of our shared past. February 1881 arrived with bitter winds that scoured the Kansas plains, driving most of Dodge City's inhabitants indoors. The saloons remained crowded, the hotel lobbies filled with travelers waiting for the weather to break, and the sheriff's office maintained its appearance of orderly governance. Sheriff Blackwood used the winter conditions to his advantage, knowing that fewer people ventured into the countryside, reducing the likelihood of anyone discovering his secret establishment. 3 new acquisitions, as Blackwood had begun referring to his captives in his meticulous journals, arrived during these harsh winter weeks. The first was Sarah Coleman, a free black woman who had been working as a laundress for the railroad workers. Her disappearance caused little stir. Transient workers often moved on without announcement, following the progress of the tracks or seeking better opportunities in other frontier towns. Only her cousin, a cook at the Dodge House Hotel named Eliza, asked questions about Sarah's sudden departure, questions that Blackwood dismissed with practiced ease. "Likely moved on to Wichita," he told the concerned woman. "Said something about better pay down there. Don't worry yourself. That's just how these people are. Here one day, gone the next." The second new captive was a young Cheyenne man named White Horse, who had been found hunting on land recently claimed by white settlers. Though no crime had actually been committed, the boundaries of property remained fluid and contested in the region. Blackwood arrested him on charges of poaching and trespassing. White Horse's family, living in a small encampment along the Arkansas River, were told he had been transferred to a military facility for trial. No such transfer had occurred. The third was William Johnson, an educated black man who had arrived in Dodge City with dreams of opening a small general store. His mistake had been challenging Blackwood's authority during a public meeting, questioning whether the sheriff's methods were being applied equally to all citizens regardless of color. 3 days later, Johnson disappeared while walking home from a business meeting. His rented room at the boarding house remained untouched, his small inventory of goods abandoned, as if he had simply vanished into the prairie air. At Blackwood's exhibition, a term he increasingly used in his private documentation, these new arrivals faced the same degradation as those who had preceded them. Their personal belongings were confiscated and cataloged as cultural artifacts. Their names were replaced with numbers and racial classifications. Their living conditions were deliberately manipulated as part of what Blackwood called his environmental studies, with some prisoners receiving more food or blankets than others, their reactions meticulously recorded in the sheriff's growing collection of journals. Inside the main exhibition building, Blackwood had created what he proudly described to his select visitors as living dioramas of natural human development. Captives were forced to wear clothing that corresponded not to their actual cultural backgrounds, but to Blackwood's distorted understanding of racial hierarchy. Native Americans were dressed in exaggerated versions of traditional clothing, often mixing items from entirely different tribes. Black captives were given ragged clothes that deliberately evoked slavery, regardless of whether they had been born free. These costumes were part of Blackwood's narrative, props in the story he was constructing about human difference and what he called scientific proof of natural order. The visitors to this grotesque display were growing in number as Blackwood carefully expanded his network of like-minded individuals. A banker from Topeka arrived with a photographer who took detailed images of the captives, images later circulated among a select group of self-described anthropological enthusiasts. A doctor from St. Louis spent 3 days conducting invasive physical examinations of the prisoners, measuring skulls and facial features for a paper he planned to publish in an obscure medical journal. Each visitor validated Blackwood's belief that he was engaged in important work, scientific research that transcended ordinary moral considerations. What the sheriff failed to recognize was that his expanding operation created an expanding risk. More captives meant more opportunities for resistance. More visitors meant more potential witnesses who might eventually speak out. The two guards, Fowler and Reed, were becoming increasingly unstable under the psychological strain of their duties, turning to whiskey for relief and sometimes engaging in acts of spontaneous cruelty that even Blackwood found excessive and unscientific. Most significantly, connections were forming among the captives themselves. Despite Blackwood's attempts to segregate them according to his racial categories, the shared experience of their imprisonment created bonds that transcended the sheriff's artificial divisions. In the rare moments when the guards were distracted or absent, whispered conversations took place across cell barriers. Sarah Coleman, who could read and write, began secretly documenting their experiences by scratching notes into the wooden beams of her cell with a nail she had pried loose from her bed frame. Whitehorse, skilled in tracking and survival from his Cheyenne upbringing, silently mapped the movements of the guards and identified potential weaknesses in the security of the compound. William Johnson, whose education included some legal training, memorized the names and descriptions of every visitor who came through the exhibition, understanding that these details might someday be crucial evidence. Together, though unable to communicate freely, they were building a collective resistance through knowledge, patience, and the human capacity for hope, even in the most desperate circumstances. In Dodge City itself, small inconsistencies in Blackwood's carefully maintained facade were beginning to emerge. Eliza had not accepted the sheriff's dismissive explanation of her cousin Sarah's disappearance and had begun asking questions among the laundry workers and railroad employees. The family of Whitehorse, despite being told to stay away from town, sent a young boy to observe the jail from a distance, noting that no prisoners had been transferred to any military wagon on the day the sheriff claimed. The business associates of William Johnson, expecting contracts and correspondence, wrote letters inquiring about his sudden silence. Each of these threads was thin and easily dismissed on its own, but together they formed a growing web of questions that would eventually require answers. The sheriff focused on expanding his collection and documenting what he believed would be his legacy to science, failed to notice these early warning signs. His confidence had grown into arrogance, his initial caution giving way to a belief in his own invulnerability. As March approached, bringing the first tentative signs of spring to the Kansas prairie, the situation at the hidden compound was reaching a critical point. The captives were suffering from the cumulative effects of malnutrition, confinement, and abuse. The guards were becoming increasingly erratic, their fear of exposure competing with their deteriorating moral restraint. And Sheriff Blackwood, driven by his disturbing vision, was planning the largest viewing event yet, an invitation-only gathering of 20 influential men from across the region who shared his interest in scientific racial studies. What none of them realized was that this planned event would set in motion the beginning of the end for Blackwood's human exhibition. The winds of change that were starting to blow across the prairie would soon become a storm that would expose the darkness hiding behind the badge of Dodge City's respected sheriff. By mid-March 1881, the first tentative signs of spring began to soften the harsh Kansas landscape. The snows retreated, revealing muddy roads and the first brave shoots of prairie grass. In Dodge City, the change of season brought increased activity as cattle drives prepared to resume, and new settlers arrived on the eastbound trains. For Sheriff Clayton Blackwood, the warming weather presented both opportunities and challenges for his secret operation outside town. The exhibition building required repairs after the harsh winter. The roof had developed leaks that threatened Blackwood's detailed documentation, and one section of fencing had been damaged by the freeze-thaw cycles of the Kansas winter. These practical concerns occupied the sheriff's attention as he divided his time between his official duties in town and his obsessive management of what he now openly called his Museum of Human Development in his private journals. It was during these repair efforts that the first significant crack appeared in the foundation of Blackwood's carefully constructed world. Marcus Reed, the younger and more unstable of the two guards, had been drinking heavily one evening while on duty. His drunken rage focused on Whitehorse, the young Cheyenne man who had maintained a quiet dignity that Reed found personally offensive. The guard entered Whitehorse's cell and began a brutal beating that would have likely resulted in death had his partner James Fowler not intervened. "You'll ruin everything," Fowler hissed, pulling Reed away from the severely injured captive. "The boss needs them alive for his studies. You know the rules." The incident created multiple problems for Blackwood. Whitehorse required medical attention that couldn't be provided at the compound without raising questions. Reed's reliability was increasingly in doubt. Most concerning to the sheriff, the other captives had witnessed the assault, their fear now tinged with a dangerous anger that could potentially lead to resistance. Blackwood decided to make an example of Reed, not out of any moral concern for Whitehorse, but to reassert his authority over both the guards and the captives. The next morning, with all 13 prisoners forced to watch, Blackwood publicly dismissed Reed, withholding his final payment and ordering him to leave the property immediately. "This operation demands scientific discipline," he announced, his voice carrying across the compound yard. "Violence without purpose has no place in our work here." It was a calculated decision that would have unforeseen consequences. Reed, humiliated and resentful, left the compound but did not leave the region. Instead, he took a room at a cheap boarding house on the outskirts of Dodge City and began drinking away what remained of his savings. His bitterness festered along with his growing fear of potential consequences for his involvement in the sheriff's operation. In his drunken ramblings at various saloons, he began dropping vague hints about Blackwood's collection and things you wouldn't believe happening outside town. Most dismissed these mutterings as the delusions of a drunk, but a few fragments reached attentive ears. Among them was Eliza, the hotel cook still searching for answers about her missing cousin, Sarah. Though Reed never mentioned specific names, his references to a colored laundress who was part of the sheriff's studies were enough to transform Eliza's concerns into something more focused and urgent. Meanwhile, at the compound, another potential threat to Blackwood's operation was developing. The upcoming viewing event, scheduled for the first weekend in April, required additional preparations. Blackwood had commissioned the printing of elaborate invitations and a program describing his specimens in pseudo-scientific language. The printer, a new arrival to Dodge City named Thomas Mercer, found the content disturbing but assumed it was related to some type of theatrical performance or traveling exhibition. His curiosity was piqued, however, by the secrecy surrounding the event and the prominent names included on the guest list. I need everyone watching this video right now to pause and ask yourself, if I had lived in that time, would I have had the courage to question authority figures like Sheriff Blackwood? Or would I have remained silent? Leave your honest answer in the comments below with the words, "I would have." Back at the exhibition, William Johnson was putting his legal knowledge to use. During the forced observation of Reed's dismissal, he had noticed something significant. Sheriff Blackwood had provided written documentation of Reed's employment and termination. This suggested that somewhere, perhaps in the main house where Blackwood kept his office, there existed written records of the entire operation, employment contracts, purchase orders for materials, possibly even documentation of how the captives had been acquired. If such records could be found and removed from the compound, they might provide the evidence needed to expose Blackwood's crimes. Johnson managed to communicate this insight to Sarah Coleman during their brief supervised exercise period in the yard. Sarah, whose position as a house servant gave her marginally more freedom of movement within the compound, promised to watch for any opportunity to access Blackwood's office. That opportunity came sooner than expected. The day before the scheduled viewing event, Blackwood received an urgent message from town requiring his immediate attention, a situation involving one of the prominent guests who had arrived early and was creating a disturbance at the Dodge House Hotel. With Fowler now the only guard remaining and occupied with final preparations for the exhibition building, Blackwood left the compound in haste, expecting to return before nightfall. In his rush, the sheriff failed to lock his office door. Sarah, assigned to clean the main house that afternoon, seized the moment. She quickly located several ledgers and loose papers, taking only what she could conceal beneath her clothing without raising suspicion. Among her findings was a list of all 13 captives, their actual names alongside their exhibition designations, and the false charges Blackwood had used to justify their disappearance from public record. When Blackwood returned that evening, he showed no signs of suspecting that his documents had been disturbed. His mind was occupied with the following day's event, which he believed would establish his reputation among a select circle of influential men who shared his twisted views. He conducted a final inspection of the exhibition building, where the captives had been arranged in their display areas according to his grotesque vision of human classification. "Tomorrow," he told Fowler as they locked the building for the night, "we make history. These men will return to their cities and spread word of our work. This is only the beginning." But as Blackwood spoke confidently of the future, the seeds of his downfall were already taking root. Reed's loose tongue in the saloons of Dodge City, Mercer's growing concerns about the unusual printing job, Eliza's focused determination to find her cousin, and the stolen documents now hidden in Sarah Coleman's cell, each represented a growing threat to the sheriff's secret operation. That night, as darkness settled over the Kansas prairie, the human beings trapped in Blackwood's exhibition prepared themselves in different ways for the degradation that awaited them the following day. Some prayed in whispered voices, finding strength and faith that had sustained them through months of captivity. Others retreated into memories of freedom, of family, of dignified lives that seemed increasingly distant. Whitehorse, still recovering from Reed's assault, sang a quiet Cheyenne healing song that carried through the walls of the exhibition building, and in her cell, Sarah Coleman carefully tore the stolen list of captives into 13 pieces. When morning came and the prisoners were given their meager breakfast, she managed to pass a piece to each person, tangible proof that their true identities had not been erased, that the names given to them by family and history still existed somewhere beyond the walls of their prison. It was a small act of resistance, but it carried an important message. They were not forgotten. They were not merely specimens, and perhaps if the outside world could be made to see the truth, they were not without hope. April 2nd, 1881 dawned clear and mild over the Kansas plains, a perfect spring day that belied the horrors scheduled to unfold at Sheriff Blackwood's compound. By mid-morning, the first carriages began arriving, carrying men of wealth and influence from as far away as Chicago and St. Louis. They were doctors, academics, businessmen, and politicians, all drawn by Blackwood's carefully worded invitations promising a scientific presentation of racial development and hierarchical evidence through living specimens. The visitors were first welcomed into the main house, where Blackwood had arranged a display of his documentation and findings. Charts purporting to show racial differences in skull measurements hung alongside falsified case histories of the captives. A table held reference books on phrenology, eugenics, and other pseudoscientific theories that were gaining popularity in certain academic circles. Wine was served, cigars were lit, and the men engaged in what they considered intellectual discourse about human classification and racial theory. "Gentlemen," Blackwood announced after allowing his guests an hour to examine his materials, "what you are about to witness is the culmination of 3 years of dedicated scientific inquiry. I have created a living laboratory that demonstrates, beyond any reasonable doubt, the natural order of human development and the inherent differences between the races." The group then proceeded to the exhibition building, where James Fowler stood guard at the entrance. Inside, the captives had been arranged in a sequence that reflected Blackwood's disturbed vision of racial hierarchy. Each person was confined to a small area designed to represent what the sheriff called their natural habitat, crude and wildly inaccurate representations of different cultural environments that reflected stereotypes rather than reality. William Johnson, once a dignified businessman with plans to open a store, had been forced into ragged clothing and positioned in a cell filled with cotton plants Blackwood had specially imported for the display. Sarah Coleman stood in a mockery of a laundry room, required to repeatedly wash the same items while visitors observed. Whitehorse and the other Native American captives were placed in settings with teepees and artifacts that often belonged to tribes entirely different from their own. As the visitors moved from display to display, Blackwood provided commentary that blended actual details of the captives' lives with elaborate fabrications designed to support his theories. The men took notes, asked questions, and discussed the specimens as if they were examining objects rather than human beings subjected to profound degradation. "Note the cranial structure," said one visiting doctor, pointing to a Pawnee man who stared back with carefully controlled rage. Clearly indicative of the limitations I described in my recent paper. "The female specimen demonstrates the characteristic posture I've documented in my field studies," remarked an anthropologist from Philadelphia, watching Sarah Coleman's deliberately slowed movements, not recognizing that her awkwardness came from the stolen papers still hidden beneath her clothing. What none of the visitors noticed was the silent communication occurring between the captives throughout the exhibition. Small gestures, meaningful glances, and almost imperceptible nods conveyed a coordinated awareness that had developed during their shared imprisonment. They were watching and remembering each man who participated in their humiliation, committing faces and names to memory, just as William Johnson had taught them to do. Among the visitors was Judge Arthur Hammond from Topeka, known for his harsh sentences and racial prejudices. He spent considerable time examining Whitehorse, making notes and engaging in detailed conversation with Blackwood about the savage mind. Neither man noticed when Whitehorse's fingers briefly formed a symbol that traveled visually across the room to the other native captives, a signal meaning, "Remember this one." The exhibition lasted for 3 hours, concluding with a presentation in which Blackwood outlined his plans for expanding the operation. "With additional funding and the right connections," he told his audience, "we could double our specimen collection by year's end. Imagine the scientific papers that could emerge from such a comprehensive study." The visitors responded with enthusiasm, several pledging financial support, and others offering to connect Blackwood with additional like-minded individuals in their home cities. They departed in the late afternoon, carrying printed materials and photographs that documented their experience, believing they had participated in a legitimate scientific endeavor rather than an atrocity. As the last carriage disappeared down the road toward Dodge City, Blackwood allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The event had exceeded his expectations, establishing connections that would enable his operation to grow beyond the confines of this isolated Kansas property. In his mind, he was no longer merely a sheriff with a private obsession, but a man on the verge of recognition for his contributions to science. What he failed to recognize was that the very success of the exhibition had dramatically increased the risk of exposure. 20 additional people now held knowledge of his secret operation. The printed materials they carried could potentially fall into the hands of individuals with both the moral clarity to recognize the horror and the authority to take action. And the captives, after enduring the most public display of their dehumanization yet, had emerged with strengthened resolve rather than broken spirits. That evening, after the captives had been returned to their regular cells and Blackwood had retired to the main house to document the day's success in his journals, James Fowler made his rounds with a growing sense of unease. The lone guard had witnessed enough exhibitions to become desensitized to the cruelty, but something about this particular event had disturbed even his calloused conscience. Perhaps it was the scale of the audience, the growing ambition of Blackwood's plans, or simply the cumulative weight of his participation in months of abuse. Whatever the cause, Fowler drank more heavily than usual that night, eventually passing out at his post near the main entrance to the prisoners' quarters. His keys remained visible on his belt, an opportunity that would not go unnoticed or unused. Back in Dodge City, other developments were unfolding that would soon intersect with the events at Blackwood's compound. Eliza had finally found someone willing to take her concerns about her missing cousin seriously. A young deputy marshal named Robert Cooper, who had recently arrived from Wichita. Unlike the local deputies who worked directly under Sheriff Blackwood, Cooper represented federal authority and had no particular loyalty to the local power structure. "I've been hearing strange rumors," Eliza told him during their meeting at the back of the hotel kitchen. "A man named Reed who used to work for the sheriff has been talking about some kind of collection out at an old ranch. I think my cousin might be there, along with others who've gone missing." Cooper had his own reasons to be suspicious of Blackwood. During his first weeks in Dodge City, he had noticed discrepancies in the prisoner transfer records and unexplained patterns in the disappearance of certain individuals, particularly people of color and those without strong community connections. He had been quietly building a file of these inconsistencies, waiting for something more substantial before taking action. "Do you know where this ranch is located?" he asked Eliza. "Not exactly, but the printer, Mr. Mercer, might. He did some work for whatever happened out there today, some kind of special event with important guests." As night fell over Dodge City and the surrounding prairie, these separate threads, the exhausted captives, the drunk guard, the concerned marshal, the discarded employee, and the stolen documents, were beginning to weave together into a tapestry of potential justice. The exhibition had been Blackwood's moment of greatest pride, but it had also created the conditions for his potential downfall. The question now was, which would unfold more quickly, his plans for expansion or the growing threat of exposure? The night of April 2nd stretched long and tense across the Kansas prairie. At Blackwood's compound, a series of events began unfolding that would alter the fate of everyone involved. Shortly after midnight, Sarah Coleman made her move. With Fowler unconscious from drink and Blackwood asleep in the main house, she used a small metal shard she had pried from her bed frame to work at the lock of her cell. The skills she had developed as a laundress, deft fingers accustomed to detailed work, served her well as she manipulated the primitive mechanism. When the lock finally gave way with a soft click, she moved silently to William Johnson's adjacent cell. Together they systematically freed the other captives, each person moving with the careful silence of those for whom discovery meant certain death. Whitehorse, despite his injuries, took the lead as they approached the sleeping guard. With practiced movements that spoke of his hunting background, he removed the keys from Fowler's belt without waking him. The group faced a critical decision: what to do with the guard and, more importantly, with Blackwood. Some advocated for immediate escape, leaving both men alive but with as much head start as possible. Others, bearing the physical and psychological scars of months of abuse, argued for a more permanent solution to prevent pursuit. "We are not them," William Johnson whispered firmly as they huddled in the shadowed yard. "If we kill them, we become something else, something less than what we were before this place." In the end, they compromised. Fowler was bound and gagged, then locked in one of the cells he had previously guarded. As for Blackwood, Whitehorse and 3 others crept into the main house, finding the sheriff asleep in his bedroom surrounded by the documentation of his atrocities. They took him captive, but not before securing every journal, ledger, and photograph they could find, evidence that would later prove crucial. By the first light of dawn, the 13 former captives were moving across the prairie in 3 separate groups, heading in different directions to improve their chances of at least some reaching safety. Sarah Coleman carried the most damning of Blackwood's documents, including lists of visitors and financial supporters of the exhibition. William Johnson led another group toward Dodge City itself, believing that going directly toward danger might be the last thing Blackwood would expect. Whitehorse and the remaining native captives headed west, toward territories where tribal connections might offer protection. What none of them knew was that events were already in motion in Dodge City that would soon converge with their escape. Deputy Marshal Robert Cooper had spent the night piecing together information from multiple sources: Eliza's concerns about her missing cousin, the printer Mercer's description of the disturbing materials he had produced for Blackwood's event, and the drunken ramblings of the disgraced guard Reed, whom Cooper had located in a saloon and questioned extensively. By morning, Cooper had assembled enough troubling evidence to justify an official investigation. He recruited 2 federal agents who happened to be passing through Dodge City on another matter, and together they prepared to ride out to the location Reed had finally revealed in exchange for promises of leniency. Meanwhile, back at the compound, James Fowler had managed to free himself from his restraints by mid-morning, using a nail from the cell's wooden bench to work at the ropes binding his wrists. His first action was to release Sheriff Blackwood, who had been secured in his own bedroom with items from his collection, tribal bindings that held firm despite his struggles. Blackwood's reaction to the escape was cold, calculated rage. He didn't waste time with recriminations against Fowler for his negligence. Instead, he immediately began planning the recapture of what he still referred to as his specimens. Their escape threatened not only his scientific ambitions, but now his freedom and reputation as well. If they reached civilization with their stories and evidence, everything he had built would collapse. "They'll split up," he told Fowler as he loaded his rifle. "The savages will head west to tribal lands. The others might make for the railroad or Dodge City itself. We'll track the largest group first. They'll be the slowest." What Blackwood failed to consider was how quickly news would spread. By noon, the situation had grown far beyond his ability to control. The first of the escapees, Sarah Coleman and 4 others, had encountered a group of buffalo hunters who, shocked by their condition and story, provided food, water, and horses. 2 of the hunters immediately rode for Dodge City to alert authorities, carrying with them some of the documentation Sarah had preserved. These hunters arrived in town just as Deputy Marshal Cooper and his federal colleagues were preparing to depart for the compound. The evidence they brought transformed Cooper's investigative mission into something more urgent: a rescue operation for any remaining captives and an arrest warrant for Sheriff Clayton Blackwood on multiple federal charges. As these forces converged, Blackwood and Fowler tracking the escapees, Cooper's team heading toward the compound, and the former captives making their way across the prairie in different directions, the human cost of Blackwood's exhibition was being revealed to the wider world for the first time. The documents recovered from the compound told a story so disturbing that initial reports were met with disbelief by some and horror by others. The most damning evidence came from Blackwood's own meticulous record-keeping. His journals detailed not only the captivity and exhibition of human beings, but also implicated dozens of prominent men who had visited, funded, or otherwise supported his operation. Names of doctors, academics, businessmen, and government officials filled these pages, each now potentially facing their own reckoning for participation in what one newspaper would later call a chamber of horrors masquerading as science on the Kansas frontier. By late afternoon, William Johnson's group had reached the outskirts of Dodge City, where they encountered Eliza, who had been watching the eastern approaches to town in hopes of news about her cousin. The emotional reunion between Eliza and Sarah, who arrived with the buffalo hunters shortly thereafter, drew attention from townspeople who had long accepted Sheriff Blackwood's authority without question. As the full story began to emerge through the testimony of the former captives and the evidence they had brought with them, the community of Dodge City found itself divided. Some, particularly those who had benefited from Blackwood's selective enforcement of the law, attempted to discredit the accusations. Others, confronted with the physical evidence of abuse and the compelling testimony of multiple witnesses, were forced to acknowledge the horror that had existed just miles from their homes. The most dramatic confrontation occurred as the sun was setting over the prairie. Deputy Marshal Cooper and his team, now expanded to include several local men who had volunteered upon hearing the escapees' stories, encountered Blackwood and Fowler returning to the compound after a failed attempt to track White Horse's group. The ensuing standoff would later be described in detail by witnesses, though accounts varied on exactly what was said. What is certain is that Blackwood, when presented with the federal warrant for his arrest, made no attempt to deny his actions. Instead, he defended them with the same pseudo-scientific language he had used in his exhibition, speaking of necessary research and advancement of knowledge, even as he was being disarmed and placed in restraints. "History will vindicate my work," he reportedly told Cooper as he was led away. "Men of vision are always persecuted by the ignorant." Fowler, seeing the extent of the forces arrayed against them, surrendered without resistance, immediately offering to testify against his employer in exchange for consideration in his own case. His detailed knowledge of the operation, combined with the documentation recovered by the escapees, would ensure that the full scope of Blackwood's crimes could be established in a court of law. As night fell once more over the Kansas prairie, the human beings who had been reduced to specimens in Blackwood's exhibition began the long process of reclaiming their identities and dignity. They were offered temporary accommodation in Dodge City, though many, particularly the native captives, chose to continue their journeys toward communities where they hoped to find more meaningful support and understanding. Sarah Coleman and Eliza were reunited at last, their embrace on the steps of the Dodge House Hotel witnessed by many of the same townspeople who had for months accepted Sarah's disappearance without question. William Johnson, whose business plans had been violently interrupted by his captivity, found himself approached by several local merchants offering assistance in establishing the store he had originally come to open. Whitehorse and the other native escapees continued west, carrying with them not only their personal trauma, but also evidence of how the institutions of American justice could be perverted to serve the darkest human impulses. Their stories would eventually reach tribal leaders and, through them, advocates who had been documenting the systematic abuses perpetrated against indigenous peoples throughout the expansion of the United States. The compound itself was secured as a crime scene, with Cooper assigning guards to ensure that none of the remaining evidence was disturbed. In the coming days, more officials would arrive from Topeka and Washington to begin a thorough investigation, not only of Blackwood's crimes, but also of the network of supporters and enablers who had allowed his exhibition to continue for so long. The unraveling of Sheriff Clayton Blackwood's human zoo had begun, but the full reckoning, for the man himself, for his accomplices, and for the society that had created conditions where such atrocities could occur, was still to come. The trial of Sheriff Clayton Blackwood began on June 15, 1881, in the Topeka Federal Courthouse, far from the frontier town where he had built his reputation and concealed his crimes. The proceedings drew national attention, with newspapers from New York to San Francisco sending correspondents to cover what was being called the Kansas Human Exhibition Case. The courtroom was consistently filled beyond capacity, with spectators sometimes waiting overnight to secure a seat for the following day's testimony. The evidence presented against Blackwood was overwhelming. The prosecution introduced his own journals, the testimony of James Fowler, who had been granted partial immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and most powerfully, the direct accounts of the survivors themselves. One by one, they took the stand to describe their abduction, captivity, and the degradation they had endured as part of Blackwood's scientific studies. William Johnson's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense's attempts to frame Blackwood's actions as misguided scientific inquiry rather than criminal abuse. Johnson's eloquence and education challenged the racial stereotypes that underpinned much of Blackwood's pseudo-scientific justifications. When asked by the defense attorney whether he might have misunderstood the educational nature of Blackwood's exhibition, Johnson's response left the courtroom in stunned silence. "Sir," he said, looking directly at Blackwood rather than the attorney who had questioned him, "when a man places another human being in a cage, forces them to wear identifying markers reducing them to their race, and invites others to observe them as specimens rather than people, there is no misunderstanding possible. This was not education, it was not science. It was the deliberate infliction of suffering for profit and perverse satisfaction." Sarah Coleman's testimony recounted not only her own experience, but also her observations of how Blackwood had treated the other captives, particularly focusing on the children who had been part of the exhibition, a young Osage boy and a girl of mixed ancestry who had been displayed together as examples of what Blackwood called racial developmental comparison. Her detailed memory of the visitors who had attended the exhibitions, including several prominent men who now found themselves implicated, added another dimension to the growing scandal. Whitehorse testified through an interpreter, his dignified presence and direct manner transcending the language barrier. He described not only the physical abuse he had suffered, but also the systematic attempt to erase his cultural identity by forcing him to perform distorted versions of ceremonies and wear clothing from tribes not his own. When asked about his role in the escape, Whitehorse simply stated, "We freed ourselves because no one else would. The white man's law failed us until we forced it to see us." Blackwood's defense strategy shifted as the trial progressed, and the weight of evidence against him grew. His attorney initially attempted to portray him as a misunderstood scientific pioneer whose methods, while perhaps unorthodox, were in service to legitimate anthropological inquiry. When this approach failed to gain traction, the defense pivoted to questioning the jurisdiction of the federal court and arguing that the captives, particularly the Native Americans, did not have legal standing to bring charges against a duly appointed law enforcement officer. These arguments collapsed when the prosecution introduced evidence that Blackwood had transported at least 2 of his captives across state lines, triggering federal kidnapping statutes, and had fraudulently used his position as sheriff to falsify official records concealing his crimes. The defense's final strategy was to suggest that Blackwood had suffered from temporary mental aberration, brought on by the stresses of frontier law enforcement, a claim undermined by the methodical, years-long development of his exhibition as documented in his own journals. Blackwood himself took the stand on the 10th day of the trial, maintaining the same calm, authoritative demeanor that had served him well as sheriff. He expressed no remorse, instead doubling down on his belief in the scientific validity of his work and suggesting that future generations would recognize his contributions. His testimony, rather than generating sympathy, cemented the impression of a man whose moral compass had been irreparably distorted by racist ideology and personal ambition. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. On July 3, 1881, Judge Harmon Williams sentenced Clayton Blackwood to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, delivering a scathing assessment of his crimes that would later be quoted extensively in legal textbooks on civil rights cases. Mr. Blackwood, you have not only violated the laws of this nation, but the fundamental principles of human dignity upon which all just laws must be based. You used a position of public trust to inflict untold suffering on those you deemed lesser beings, not through passion or momentary failing, but through calculated, sustained cruelty, disguised as intellectual pursuit. There can be no greater betrayal of the badge you wore and the community you swore to protect. James Fowler received a 20-year sentence for his role as guard and enabler, while Marcus Reed, the dismissed guard whose drunken revelations had helped expose the case, was sentenced to 15 years. More complex were the cases against the visitors and financial supporters of Blackwood's exhibition. Several prominent men suddenly found their reputations and careers in jeopardy as their names emerged in connection with the case. Dr. Lawrence Stanton, a respected physician from St. Louis who had conducted examinations of the captives, was stripped of his medical license and faced his own criminal trial. Professor William Hargrove of Eastern University lost his academic position and became a pariah in scientific circles. Judge Arthur Hammond from Topeka, who had enthusiastically attended and supported the exhibition, was forced to resign from the bench amid public outcry. Others implicated in Blackwood's records faced similar professional and social consequences, though many used their wealth and connections to distance themselves from the case with varying degrees of success. For the survivors of Blackwood's exhibition, the aftermath of the trial brought complex challenges. The physical captivity had ended, but the psychological impact of their experiences remained. Some found it impossible to return to their previous lives, haunted by their treatment and the knowledge that so many had been complicit in their suffering. Others channeled their trauma into advocacy, working with early civil rights organizations to document and publicize the abuses they had endured. Sarah Coleman remained in Dodge City with her cousin Eliza, eventually opening a small seamstress shop that became known for its quality work and fair treatment of all customers regardless of race. William Johnson, after testifying at the trials of several of Blackwood's associates, moved to Chicago where he became involved in publishing, producing pamphlets and eventually books documenting the case and advocating for equal protection under the law. Whitehorse returned to his people, carrying both the scars of his captivity and a deepened resolve to resist the encroachment of those who viewed his culture and humanity as inferior to their own. The site of Blackwood's compound was eventually acquired by the federal government, the buildings demolished, and the land left to return to prairie. For years afterward, local residents avoided the area, speaking of it in hushed tones as a place marked by suffering that should be allowed to heal in solitude. No memorial was erected during the lifetimes of the survivors, many of whom expressed the wish that the location be reclaimed by nature rather than preserved as a monument to their pain. The legal and social ripples from the case extended far beyond Kansas. The trial highlighted the abuses possible when scientific racism was combined with unchecked authority, contributing to early discussions about civil rights protections and the ethical boundaries of scientific inquiry. Several states revised their laws regarding the oversight of local law enforcement, implementing new accountability measures designed to prevent similar abuses of power. Newspapers and magazines debated the wider implications of the case, with some publications using it to challenge the prevalent racial theories of the time, while others attempted to portray Blackwood as a lone extremist whose actions should not reflect on the legitimate scientific study of human difference. These debates, conducted in editorial pages and academic journals across the country, revealed the deep divisions in American society regarding race, science, and human dignity. Clayton Blackwood died in prison in 1897, never having expressed remorse for his actions. His journals and records, preserved as evidence, eventually became important historical documents, studied by scholars seeking to understand how scientific racism operated in post-Civil War America. What he had intended as his legacy to science instead became a cautionary tale about the atrocities possible when human beings are categorized as specimens rather than recognized as equals. The survivors outlived their captor. Sarah Coleman died in 1922 at the age of 74, having lived to see the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance and new generations of Black Americans asserting their rightful place in American culture and society. William Johnson passed away in 1918, leaving behind published accounts of his experiences that would later be rediscovered during the Civil Rights Movement as early documentation of the struggles for dignity and equality. Whitehorse, whose Cheyenne name has been preserved in tribal records but was often omitted from official accounts of the case, lived until 1924, a respected elder who shared his story as both warning and call to resistance. Today, the case of Sheriff Clayton Blackwood's human exhibition stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how racism, pseudoscience, and unchecked authority converged in post-Reconstruction America. It reminds us that history is not merely a record of progress, but also of darker impulses that can emerge when human dignity is subordinated to ideology and power. The courage of those who escaped, testified, and rebuilt their lives offers a counterweight to the horror, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the never-ending necessity of standing witness to truth. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Also, please like and share this video with anyone interested in the hidden chapters of American history. And if you haven't already, subscribe now to ensure you never miss these crucial revelations of our shared past that mainstream education often overlooks.